So today we're going to have a conversation with Abrahm Lustgarten from ProPublica and Keith Schneider from Circle of Blue. So welcome, Keith and Abrahm, and if we could get them spotlighted, that would be wonderful. So let me just do some brief intros and then we'll jump right into our content. So Abrahm Lustgarten is a senior environmental reporter with the focus at the intersection of business, climate, and energy. He's currently covering changes at the US EPA and working on a project about pollution at US defense sites. He was a finalist for the 2016 Pulitzer Prize. He received the 2016 Keck Futures Initiative Communication Award from the National Academies of Sciences. He co-produced a 2016 Discovery Channel film, Killing the Colorado. He's worked on many, and he's worked on other films as well, including the Emmy-nominated PBS Frontline documentary, The Spill. I can go on and on about his many awards, commendations, and coverage, but we're really thrilled to have him here today. Okay, we're really thrilled to have him here today.
For inquiries related to a recent recall on an EV product, please press 1. For all other inquiries, please remain.
Can we get that muted? Excellent, thank you.
Please remain on the line to speak with a specialist.
Wonderful.
I'm trying to find them, Rachel, sorry.
That's okay, the magic of
I got it, Brianna.
Thank
you. Okay, so let me close out Abraham's bio by sharing that he earned a master's in journalism from Columbia University and a bachelor's in anthropology from Cornell. Welcome, Abrahm. Thank you so much for joining us from ProPublica. We also have Keith Schneider with us. He is a senior editor and chief correspondent for Circle of Blue, as well as a New York Times writer. He's based in Traverse City, Michigan, with a network of journalists and scientists reporting on global trends affecting water, energy, and food. He developed Circle of Blue's renowned global choke point project on the confrontation between rising demand for energy and food in the era of diminishing freshwater reserves. In exclusive reports from 6 continents, Keith has uncovered severe water scarcity in the Yellow River Basin. He's won numerous awards for his work as a journalist, innovator, and editor, including 2 George Polk Memorial Awards for environmental and national reporting. And he writes from his home in northern Michigan, and before joining Circle of Blue, he was a media and communications director at US Climate Action Network and a communications director at the Apollo Alliance. Many more things that you could read about Keith as well. And welcome, Keith, from Circle of Blue.
Thank you.
All right. So I want to set, you all have such impressive bios. It was really hard to choose which sentences to read. So apologies for struggling through that for a minute. All right, so I want to just frame up this session by sharing a little bit about the climate and migration programs that ASAP is running, and to share some themes that are coming out of those programs to really frame up our conversation and our time together with Abrahm and Keith today. So ASAP runs member programs to address 4 capacity building outcomes: connecting, advancing adaptation careers, doing service in the adaptation field, and lifting up the voices of our members. And by participating in the Climate, Migration, and Managed Retreat member-led interest group, we are here in our ASAP Connects program area. It's all about bringing adaptation professionals and the issues they care about closer together and connecting seemingly disparate ideas and people to one another to make change together. And our work to help communities prepare to receive climate migrants really falls into that ASAP Connects program as well. And we believe that by fostering exchange and collaboration and innovation between affected communities, experts in demography and migration, and applied researchers in climatology and climate impacts, we can really understand the issue of climate migration, better, and we can make sure that we're on the right path as we think about what in-migration is going to look like and how we can plan and prepare for it. And what we're trying to do with our projects is to really fill a gap in the climate migration research, practice, and action space, which is about in-migration and receiving communities. And that's why I'm so excited to be collaborating with the CMMR group, and particularly with Judy, on this 3-part series, because there is a lot of work happening out there on climate migration, but a lot less so on in-migration and receiving communities and how to plan and prepare for that. So through this work, we're really looking to build foundational knowledge on the topic of in-migration, create new tools that can be applied in other climate receiving regions, and catalyze additional investment and research into this really critical area of adaptation and resilience work. And then finally, just as Judy was talking about, we want to cultivate a narrative around the importance of preparing not just for climate risk, but also for climate opportunities. And I'm excited specifically to be bringing the two of you in today to have a conversation about how reporting and journalism plays a role in that space, because narrative building is such an important part of what we're doing and is obviously a central part of what you're able to do in the space of journalism. So how we're doing that, we have 3 main activities. One is supporting the development of methodologies for predicting domestic migration that integrate future climate projections. Another is gathering stakeholder and Indigenous rights holder perspectives on the topic of climate-induced immigration, specifically in the Great Lakes region, and delivering outreach and education opportunities for adaptation professionals, as well as the broader community of people who are interested in this issue. All of our activities are centered in the Great Lakes region, and then we have some activities specifically focusing on New York State, and we have 2 supporters of this work, the New York State Energy Research and Development Authority, as well as the Great Lakes Integrated Sciences and Assessments Program. I want to just share really briefly and simply what we hope the outcomes of our work will be. We want to help establish a foundation for socially just and environmentally responsible growth in climate receiving regions. We believe that growth is to some extent inevitable, but it's not inevitable what that growth will bring. And we hope that through our work, that growth will be more socially just and more environmentally responsible. And secondly, but just as importantly, we want to ensure that as the science of climate-informed demography emerges, that the methodologies, the outputs of those methodologies, and how they're applied, the ways in which they're applied, become really owned and controlled by affected communities. We've seen too many times when scientific methodologies have been developed without affected communities' needs at the center, and what that can mean for justice and equity as a result. And we're hoping that by addressing this issue from the beginning, that we can have more success in having affected communities' needs put at the center of this work. And that includes affected people and communities, both from people who are moving from places, as well as people in receiving regions who are affected by an influx of migrants. And then finally, I want to share just a couple of themes that are emerging through this work that really color the way that I look at it and color the way that we've kind of started to structure this conversation that we're going to have today. So the first theme is that existing economic, cultural, and demographic conditions in the Great Lakes region are really influencing the region's preparedness for in-migration. And we have to investigate how receiving communities' physical infrastructure, social infrastructure, economies, political infrastructure, how they are set up for being able to successfully absorb influxes of migrants. And we find that local institutions have both a heightened burden and a heightened opportunity to prepare for climate migration with respect to all of these conditions. And that by connecting local institutions and local governments to one another to learn and to share how they're preparing, that is gonna be a really important foundation for success. We also, and you can read more about that in our literature review on opportunities and opportunity barriers for in-migration to the Great Lakes. And I think Brianna's going to send the link to that in the chat. We also find that the science of predicting climate-induced migration, especially domestically, is really still under development. We're working with demographer Matt Hauer out of Florida State University on all of our methodology development work, as well as several other folks on our New York State Climate Migration Modeling Accelerator. And we are finding that we don't have established methods to quantify, especially domestic climate-induced migration or its potential impacts. So this is challenging, but it also gives us the opportunity right now to make linkages, again, between affected communities, demographers, climate impact experts, governments at various scales, so that we can build out that work together in a way that's really going to ensure that the outputs of that work are used to promote socially just and environmentally responsible growth. You can read more about what we're learning about the science of predicting climate-induced migration in the summary and resources from our December 2020 Climate-Informed Demography workshop. And then finally, I just want to share, this is a long-term planning issue. And something that we're finding is that can be in tension with addressing urgent climate impacts. A lot of people are experiencing climate impacts right now, and many adaptation resources, rightfully so, are directed towards those problems. But we know that if we don't start planning now for long-term demographic shifts, then it's going to be impossible really to meet our goals of socially just and environmentally sound in migration. And we could see ourselves entrenching current issues like racial and economic segregation if we don't plan now for how we're going to transform in migration resources to receive new influxes of population. Now, one last thing before I turn it over to our speakers to kind of widen the lens for us on in-migration through telling us about their work. I want to just ground us in a couple of ideas that are emerging from our exploratory conversations with folks in the Great Lakes region. When we think about the Great Lakes region's abundant fresh water, I'm sure Keith is going to talk about this. We've got relatively mild climate impacts. We have physical infrastructure that has room to accommodate population growth. It seems an obvious choice for a climate migration destination. But stakeholders and Indigenous rights holders in the region hold complex perspectives and needs. And we have to be careful and intentional in the way that we plan, the way that we engage with affected communities in receiving regions. And that starts with connecting with people in those places to share their own stories. And that's why I'm particularly excited, again, to be in conversation today with Abrahm, whose groundbreaking reporting is really shaping what it means to tell the story of climate migration and is a critical tool for our community moving forward as we seek to share stories and encourage the kind of dialogue that will lead us not just to inevitable population growth in climate safe regions, but really help us seize the opportunity to use that growth to transform into a more environmentally responsible, climate resilient, and socially just society. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Abrahm to share a bit about his work.
Thank you, Rachel, and hello, everybody. It's fantastic to be here. I really appreciate this group's interest in the subject matter and all of the work that you've done. I've been speaking a lot about this issue and doing a lot of presentations like this, and in the vast majority of them, really introducing the concept of climate and migration as if it's something that people haven't really given a lot of thought to, and it sounds like it's quite the opposite with this group here. And so, I appreciate the backgrounding and careful consideration that's already been given. And, perhaps my comments will be a little bit basic, or at least kind of start with a very broad perspective and maybe catch up with the thinking that you're already doing now. But I want to start by telling you a little bit about this project that I did published over the last year, but really completed over 2 years of reporting with the New York Times Magazine in partnership with ProPublica about climate migration. And it was a series of 3 stories that were published throughout the latter half of 2020, examining the issue of climate and migration around the world, narrowing it a bit to look at how we in the United States are similarly affected and what issues we might be facing or can expect here. And looking at this question of, do some nations, do some regions stand to win economically or otherwise, as a result of both climate change and the migration that it brings? And that story focused on opportunities that Russia in particular, might see in the future, but other regions, northerly regions like Canada as well. So this research started, early in 2019, and it really started with a question of how would climate change affect where and how people live. I think that in the media universe and in general discourse, we tend to give a lot of thought to climate change from a scientific perspective. What does the data say? What weather changes or environmental changes can we expect? And a lot less consideration to how people live with those changes. So, this was an intent to start looking at the human reaction to our changing circumstances. The early consensus pretty quick in that reporting was that climate would cause indeed great migration globally. The food scarcity would drive people away from their home communities. The heat and drought would displace people, potentially in extraordinary numbers. One very influential study for me was a study published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences that looked at where humans have lived on the planet over the last 6,000 years and essentially found that people have thrived in a relatively small band of environment, and that band now covers about 1% of the surface of the planet, but soon will be shifting so that the unlivable parts of the planet will cover about 20% of the globe. And that suggests that 2 billion to 3 billion people could be facing this question of, where should they go? Can they continue to survive in their home communities, or do they need to seek an environment that's more suitable? There's obvious hotspots around the world for the most intense displacement that we can expect, and the World Bank has been a leader in studying what migration might arise out of those hotspots. They're Northern Africa, the Sahel region, Southern South Asia, and Central America, Guatemala, El Salvador, Honduras, and migration is particularly complicated, as it sounds like you're familiar with, but people move for lots of reasons. Often, those reasons are interconnected, whether it's, economic drivers or seeking of opportunity in a new place, like, Central Americans moving to the United States, or drought making it difficult to grow enough food or subsist in homelands. And one of the challenges in looking at environmental migration or climate-induced migration is trying to, parse out what is the driver. Do we need to identify a single driver? Does it matter if climate is a subtle influence or a major influence or the only influence? So it's incredibly difficult, to be precise about what the figures are and what the size of that migration might be. One of the goals we had in taking on this project was to see if we might be able to quantify and predict that movement a little bit better, because while there was great and growing consensus that there would be a large climate migration, there was not much consensus, and still is not, about exactly who will move and where they'll go. And unless you have a sense of that scale and timing, it's very difficult to prepare, plan, and adapt. And the experts I spoke with from the World Bank, academic institutions, and elsewhere, all agree that preparation and adaptation is really the key to maintaining some stability and avoiding the potential conflict, the worst case outcomes that can come from a large scale migration. So I did go down and spent considerable time reporting in Central America as a part of the research for this project. But the second component of it is what I wanted to talk a little bit more about today, which is that effort to try to quantify and predict the migration. And to do that, we took on a really ambitious modeling project, where we took the early work that the World Bank had begun, and I partnered with researchers at the City University of New York to see if we could expand that model into, what I kind of hoped would be like an artificial intelligence sort of unit, where we could ask it questions and it would tell us how many Guatemalans will move to the United States or will move to, to San Salvador, and so on. It was a 9-month project in the making, and extraordinarily complex, and taught us a lot about the difficulties of that sort of predictive modeling and calculation. Like Rachel was saying, it's a difficult process, and not a one with very clear outcomes, at least now. But it was useful for us because it did draw broad differences between different trajectories of policy and global response. And I think that those, I'll tell you what they were for global migration in Central America, but I think that they offer some parallels for what we can expect in the United States as well. And it was essentially different government policy and responses made a dramatic difference in the outcomes that our model projected on the order of millions of people. And in general, open borders, foreign aid, greater international cooperation, including urban planning and investment in cities like Guatemala City or San Salvador, all led to significant differences in how many people migrated towards the United States from Guatemala, according to the model, but also how many people were trapped at home and what their relative welfare, income levels, and food supplies would be at home. And essentially, the more that we chose, the model suggested that the more that we choose to push people away, close borders, limit trade, build walls on the borders, the greater the ultimate suffering and poverty is in those source communities. And it frames the choice that, even though it looks into the future, it sets parameters for how accountable we are in receiving communities for the suffering of people in out migration communities. Hopefully that gives us also the tools to some guidance to, for how to act and how to respond. Turning from that global project and that immense modeling effort, the second story in the series really looked at the United States and what kind of internal migration we can expect here in this country. And, there's fundamental differences in, our wealth and our privilege here compared to the other parts of the world that I was looking at. But the basic dynamic is the same. And it's that, this striking environmental change is going to increasingly force people to reconsider their sense of home. We didn't model the migration in the United States, but we used an unprecedented collection of data to look at the changing environmental conditions to imagine how, how the geography of those conditions would begin to push people to move. And we mapped them together to look at a national image of the United States and kind of see where, what places remain untouched. Be happy to know the Great Lakes is one of them, or sort of, the northern and central parts of the Midwestern part of the country look the best. What you see is kind of this picture of the walls closing in across the country. You have intense wildfire, heat, and drought coming from the west. Sea level rise affecting the south coasts and the east coasts, as well as heat. More substantial and disastrous hurricanes hitting the Gulf Coast and the southeast as well. Declining crop yields through the productive farm country parts of the Midwest and the Southwest and so forth. In what amounts to really a barrage of changing conditions over the next 20 to 30 years. And you couple that with the limited climate migration research that's been done in the US, and it suggests that about 1 in 12 Americans will move, and that they'll likely move northward towards the northeast, the northwest, and towards the Great Lakes. And that's kind of the jumping off point or the finishing point of the work that we did in that series. And is the subject of a book that I'm working on now, which is focused more intently on climate and migration in the United States, both looking at the emergence of climate-induced migration and how much of it's already happening, and also what we can look to in the future, where people will go, how cities will prepare. And to that end, I'm happy to answer more questions about that, but I'm also eager to learn from you all about what you're thinking and seeing in that regard as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Abrahm. And I think there was a request, if you wouldn't mind putting in the chat that list of policy initiatives, so folks can kind of meditate on that. And I really appreciate what you said about reconsidering a sense of home. And then also, I loved how you started with international and then went to domestic, because we can think about the entire US as a receiving place. And that really changes the conversation of what we mean by receiving community. And I think having the international and domestic elements in conversation with each other is really instructive. All right, so we're going to hear a bit from Keith now to introduce his work. was Circle of Blue, and then we're gonna open it up to a broader conversation.
Thanks, Rachel, and thank you, Abrahm. So we took this up where Abrahm left off, and there's a couple of sort of preliminary thoughts that I'd like to introduce to the group. The one is that climate change is becoming an organizing principle, not only for our culture, but for our politics and for our economy. And climate change could well be an organizing principle for Michigan's economy. And this is not the first time that Michigan has presented an organizing principle that's influenced the country. I mean, we invented the drive-through economy. This state invented sprawl, and it invented the roads and sewers, the planning, the displaced and expansive civilizing pattern that nobody had ever seen. And we introduced that at the World's Fair in 1939 in the Futurama exhibit by GM, and then put in place the policy initiatives to produce the drive-through economy, which worked really well for 50 years and is now beginning to fall apart because it's expensive, it's resource dependent. So one is that climate change is becoming an organizing principle. And it's running headlong into basic cultural political conflict about whether we plan for the future or we look to the past. So we have sort of one party that's beginning to organize its economic political infrastructure around clean energy, electrified transportation, advanced manufacturing, organic foods, better farm practices, that kind of thing. And we have one party that's organizing its principle around fear and looking to the past to be able to cement in place its patrons, fossil fuel industry, big manufacturing, big banking, corporate agriculture, whatever the rest. So we have this conflict in how we approach the future. And we can look at this pessimistically, or we can look at it optimistically. And I'm an inveterate optimist, and I choose to view it optimistically as ASAP views it. So within that context, Circle of Blue, which is a small, very capable nonprofit news organization based in Traverse City, has been looking at these issues all over the world. I've had the privilege of writing about climate migration, climate effects on agriculture, on industry, on culture, on people, on death and dying on 6 continents. And I've been doing this since 2008. So the fact that climate change is occurring is not a question to me. I mean, it's happening swiftly, and it's an example of where science has predicted the future. Science has been really good at projecting the consequences of climate change. So what ASAP is doing is trying to do the next generation of climate science, which is to determine as best it can and develop methodologies about how people will move. I mean, when will, husband and wife, boyfriend and girlfriend look across the table and say, honey, it's time to move. So that's what ASAP's doing. In Michigan, the organizing principle that we looked at from the beginning of our project was an optimistic view that climate change, despite the consequences here, and we've had significant consequences of climate change in this state. We had a terrible flood in mid-Michigan here last summer that caused $200 million plus damage. Nobody died, but we had very heavy rains that blew out 2 old dams and flooded the central part of the state. And we've had others. We've had terrible floods up in the Upper Peninsula, took out roads. It's caused tremendous millions of dollars of damage. We've had all kinds of shoreline damage because the lakes aren't freezing over, and the waves in October and November and January are terrific, have terrific energy and are pounding our lake shores. So we've had climate change, but we haven't had the consequences like they've had out west or out south. Huge fires, terrible melts, vicious storms. We don't have the same kinds of climate consequences. Our story began with looking at what we've seen around the country, around the world, and saying to ourselves, hey, we live in this incredible la-la land. I mean, we don't have major fires, weather's pretty good, it's warming up in the winter, got all the water, and water is going to be the central resource of climate change in the world. I mean, water will determine whether people are going to move or not. And we've had some prior experience in studying this, and we did it in the late 80s, looking at plants and animals and how they were moving as a result of climate change, about changing climate. when I was a young reporter at the New York Times, I did a story out of the University of Michigan's Biological Resource Station near Pellston in northern Michigan. And James Thierry, who was a prominent climate scientist, this is a year after 1989, a year after Jim Hansen had declared in a congressional hearing that climate change had already begun. And the New York Times took that really seriously and led the paper with it. And Jim looked at his data from the Biological Research Station, and he saw that plants and animals were moving. Plants, that ferns and fish and mammals that were common to the southern mixed hardwood forests of the Midwest and the East were migrating into northern Michigan. And to the same extent, small mammals and trees and orchids that were common to the North were moving into southern Michigan. And this study that he did on migration patterns became really relevant, this year, after Abrahm had published these incredible pieces in the Times and on ProPublica that actually had a database assigned to it and gave us real numbers to work with to make the argument that Michigan could become a climate refuge because of our ecological abundance, our ecological values, our ecological resources. And I began looking around to try to put the data points together into this narrative and found ASAP, the American Society of Adaptation Professionals. What a great name. That are looking at, developing the next generation of climate scientists. And it's in Michigan. It's here. It's in Ypsilanti. We have a thought leader on this important science that's right in Michigan. And I had this long conversation with Beth Gibbons, who has been the head of ASAP for several years. ASAP, by the way, is a decade old. And she said, this is hard to do, but we've begun to put in place the kinds of science that we're going to need to help predict the future and help, government units make the investments that they think they need to make because people are going to come back to Michigan, which has been a leader in outmigration for decades. And I said, well, how are we going to do that? And she laid out sort of some of the methodologies and some of the places where ASAP is working. One of the things that is leading to a positive, optimistic view that Michigan can do this well is that we already have the footprint in our cities. Our cities, most of them have half the people in them that they were built for. This is especially true in the Detroit region. So Detroit region has 5 million people in it. That's not changed since the 1950s. Those people are just spread out. Well, so that's left Detroit and its near suburbs with a lot of infrastructure investment that's not serving a big population. And Detroit could very easily incorporate more than 2-3 million more immigrants without any more land use, but it would have to modernize. And what we also know is that in Detroit is modernizing. They've had some really smart stormwater rules about helping to deal with the storms down there. They've spent over $1 billion on stormwater management and put in place policy initiatives to encourage large landowners who have, surface parking lots, large paid parking lots, to actually deal with it. In the North, we have some very, green cities led by Traverse City that understands what climate change means for the city and is beginning to embrace some changes in how to deal with it because Traverse City has suddenly become a magnet of new population growth. This is after maybe 20 years here of a pretty stagnant population growth in northern Michigan, with the exception of Traverse City. So Traverse City is trying to understand how to put more people in a tight space. And one of the big conversations that's happening in Traverse City as a result of that is a lot of conversation about workforce housing. Northern Michigan become the center of debate about workforce housing because not only are we anticipating more people coming back here because of climate, but we also are building a kind of an economy that makes it attractive for young people to move here. So we're seeing a lot of young people moving here, another population kind of growth in this area. Since the 1990s, we haven't had that, where the communities are beginning to say, how do we plan for this without, wrecking the ecological values that are bringing people here? What else can I offer about this? The last thing I want to say about Michigan is that Michigan has ecological virtues that most states don't have. And one of them is we have a large public domain here. It's over 4 million acres in state and federal land, largest public domain east of the Mississippi. And it's the center of a very large multi-billion-dollar recreational economy. We also have enormous, lengthy, huge, expansive, very productive forests. So the forests of the Northern Great Lakes is $100 billion a year industry for, all of the permutations of forestry, for recreation, for timber management, for land management, for sales, for paper production, all of it. And that forest is not burning like it does in the West, nor do foresters here anticipate that it will burn, because we have moisture here that keep the forest tempers and moist so that they don't burn. Well, what we do with that forest, how we manage runoff from that forest, erosion from the forest, cutting from the forest, the management of the forest, it's a huge ecological virtue that can become the center of this anticipated migration into Michigan. So we see in our project, we see a lot of opportunity to make climate change and in-migration an organizing principle for our economy, for our politics, for our social well-being, and that's I think that sums up what we were after in this project.
Thanks so much, Keith. And I just love how you talk about my home state of Michigan as such a jewel, both in being ecologically blessed and our opportunity to really welcome people to the state. And I appreciate also that you brought up the issue of forestry. That's been coming up a lot in our conversations as well, both as an opportunity, but also as a risk, as development pressures encroach on forested land. And what we're hearing from folks is that that can be a risk to the forestry industry, and it can also be a risk to Indigenous rights holders exercising their treaty rights in the Northern Forest region as well. So it's a really interesting and complex entry point, I think, into this conversation of in-migration to the region. So, there are so many things that we could get into here. And since we are running short on time, I just want to throw one question out to the two of you to respond to before we open it up to the rest of the group for questions. As I shared before, when ASAP thinks about this work, preparing communities to receive climate migrants, we really have two goals. We want to support socially just and environmentally sound growth in receiving regions, and we want to center affected individuals' experiences in the development of methodologies and policies and practices that might shape what migration looks like. How do those two goals play into your experience or the lenses that you use in reporting on this issue of climate migration? So the desire to support socially just and environmentally sound growth, and also to center affected individuals' experiences. Could you share a bit about that?
I suppose.
Yeah, go for it.
Yeah, I'll jump in. I mean, climate is affecting or people around the world, but people in the United States unequally. It is exacerbating racial divides and income divides that have long existed because of unequal policies historically, and making each of those policies worse. And so, Keith mentioned the pressures on urban in-migration centers, and it's a theme that comes up again and again throughout the world. But the capacity of Northern American cities, to absorb more people and support them with existing infrastructure is great, and it's one of the things that opens the door for opportunity as people move and migrate. A different kind of comparison is the intense urbanization that's happening in the city of Atlanta. And Atlanta was one place where I focused on some of my reporting. And one of the things that's come up, as Atlanta has, and you're working with Matt Hauer, he's modeled a lot of the population growth and influx into the Atlanta region that will come from increased hurricane pressures in the southeastern United States. So Atlanta's tried to get ahead of this and be proactive in terms of building its own resilience, and it's taken on a number of greening projects. It's tried to enhance its water supply. It's turned an old urban quarry into a reservoir. Atlanta's as short on water as many parts of the American Southwest, interestingly. But what people in Atlanta are learning is that each of those projects have led to increased gentrification and unfortunately exacerbated a lot of the racial and income divides that have already characterized parts of Atlanta. The outer rings of Atlanta are some of the poorest urban areas in the country. And so the very efforts that were meant to build resilience, improve the quality of life, and prepare that city for growth are having the effect of improving the quality of life and preparing the city for growth of wealthy and whiter communities at the expense of poorer and Black communities. And the conversation that's evolving out of that development is one about, what does resilience mean? This goal of of making communities better able to withstand the pressures of a changing climate, in some ways kind of suggests maintaining the status quo. And I think we're at an era at the moment where the status quo is not sufficient, or that's not really the ultimate goal. And so that's become sort of a teaching example for me, and I think for a lot of other cities that I'm speaking with and that are looking at at these issues about how you want to define the growth of the future, and if building shoring up the systems of the past are a good way to support growing population, or if you need systemic changes that can accommodate that growth while making the housing shortages more equitable, getting rid of food deserts and bridging the equity divide a little bit more. That's one way that I see it.
Yeah, thanks, and thanks for that example.
As I said, climate change and how we respond to it also, it's going to be it is an organizing principle in so many places now, right? And it's also an organizing principle for the opposition to any changes as a result of climate, in groups that don't even believe that it's happening and are busy protecting the sources of energy and the practices that exacerbate climate change. We're at this place in America, and certainly in our state, where we're not agreed about which way to go, right? Which way are we going to go? Are we going to defend, the existing way and practice, basically defending, our late 20th century practices, or we move into something that's different? Frankly, I don't think that the pessimistic view can hold water, because the Earth itself is pushing us to have to embrace a new way of thinking about what's coming. And that itself is so difficult in the United States, and certainly in Michigan, is to think about planning for the future as a body politic, right? Government actually planning for the future. Really hard to do because of the cost, expenses, taxes, who's being helped, who's being hurt. ASAP members know full well that, rolling a bowling ball down the middle of a highway would engender a huge dispute about where it would land, how big it was, whether the highway is adequate. I mean, so we have to, climate change is going to push the world to alter, probably powerfully alter, how it views its responsibilities in every sector, and certainly in the infrastructure sector, how local governments and state governments and national governments spend their money, right? How are ports going to respond to higher sea level? How do we respond to in-migration, where people will be coming? When will they be coming? When will that start? These are all things that America nor any other country does very well. We don't do that well, is to recognize and plan for the future that way. And if we don't, if we don't plan and we're reacting, we turn into Sierras in California, right? Which, the fire threat in the Sierras has been ongoing and coming and predicted for decades, and now it's here.
Yeah, thanks, Keith. We're getting so many great questions into the chat. There's one thing that's coming up, which is about, how do we know, or why do we think that there's going to be such widespread migration from one region to another? So over large geographic distances and huge numbers of people. And I want to say really clearly from our perspective, like we don't know that for sure. We don't have the numbers that tell us that for sure. And the methodologies are still in their infancy, especially for domestic migration. But when we talk about this being a long-term planning issue, that's what underscores the idea that we do need to be planning for migration at that scale. And that being said, and I'm sure that hopefully you've had a chance to peruse some of the language in the actual questions that have come in. Do you want to respond to that at all? This idea of huge, large scales? Yes. Yeah, go for it, Keith.
Yeah, I mean, we've seen it. I've reported on it. I mean, it's happening. Circle of Blue early, before this was even a topic. One of its first international projects was in Tehuacan, Mexico, in which we discovered that the drought was driving young men off the farms. And where were they heading? Into the southern border, right? Into our southern border. So the factor in southern migration and migration into the United States was drought in central Mexico, in the Tehuacan Valley, and others that are affected. We reported on Syria, North Africa, right? The Syrian president, irrigated the desert for export agriculture, cotton. And when the drought occurred and the irrigation region dried up, 1 million Syrians left the farm country into unstable cities and exacerbated the civil war. What did that happen? Migration into Europe. What was that result? Along with similar drought in North Africa, pushing people off the ground into Europe. What did that do? Destabilized politics across all of Europe. It's been as destabilizing. Migration off of climate affected lands into Europe and into the United States has destabilized politics in both countries. So I've reported it. I've seen it. I've been there. South Africa. I was in South Africa in 2016, the start of a really massive drought that damn near left Cape Town dry and prompted all kinds of internal migrations among farm workers. Farm workers, hundreds of thousands of farm workers moving back and forth from KwaZulu-Natal which is on the East Coast, to Western South Africa looking for work, I mean, so I've seen it. I've visited, I've reported about it. I'm an eyewitness to it. Yes, it's coming. The question in the United States is when, right? That's what you guys are trying to figure out, right?
We're trying to figure it out.
Yeah, the fact that it's going to occur, absolutely. We've had major migrations in the United States already. I'm reading Isabel Wilkerson's wonderful book about the Black migration out of the South, right? 6 million people starting in about the First World War, ending in the 1970s, right? And all of the consequences of that caused by, state-sponsored terrorism and economic opportunity, right? You want to take that up from Abrahm, the rest of that story?
Yeah, I'll add a quick thought, but then we can move on. I mean, so Keith's exactly right. I mean, there's numerous examples, and more important than just the way that we've documented the examples, there's empirical research that's measured those examples. So there's a number of studies that have looked at how droughts and the inability to support livestock led to, the uprising or contributed to the uprising in Syria and the migration into Europe, and the same in Mexico. So you have that, migration is a very natural form of adaptation. It always has been from the beginning of time. What's different now is that the climate's changing more rapidly, and we have vastly larger numbers of people than the planet's ever supported before. And so when you combine that, the history of understanding that people do move and migrate with an understanding of what the environments are where people have always chosen to live, and then you can map those changes in geographic environments, and you can see to look at the United States that, southern Texas and Arizona are going to move outside of, the temperature range that supported human life traditionally, that the ability to grow food is going to shift outside of those optimal bands that have supported growing communities. That's where the hypothesis stems from, that some number of people will move north. Not everybody; those aren't places that will be evacuated or unsurvivable. But those are the indicators of some significant movement out of those areas.
And I think the last piece of this is, I think Americans, as people in other parts of the world, recognize how vulnerable we are. I did a long project in Texas last year looking at water, Texas's water security issues, problems. Texas at that time, this is January 2020, was booming everywhere I was. I've never, I've been a lot of places in the world. I've never seen Houston or Dallas or San Antonio or Austin. I mean, these booming cities that were happening. And a month after I left, Texas came to a halt because nature attacked the whole country, right, with a virus. And all of that economic surging just shut down. And then a year later, Texas was hit by this incredible freeze that left people without water and electricity for days, and left millions of people having to really, really scramble to stay alive and to stay safe. And so when I called now Texas, I'm in touch with people in Texas. I tell them, well, y'all can come up to Michigan. We're ready for you. We're going to be a climate refuge. And it's not like they scoff at that. They're like, oh, yeah. They understand that Texas is not, beyond Texas, which has always seen itself as beyond nature's ability to control anything, now sees as nature as a really big factor in the well-being of that state. And California's already there, right? Auburn, right? California well understands that issue. So we have the two largest states in the country now grappling with how vulnerable they are to nature's power, period.
So we're at the top of the hour. I want to just acknowledge the time and encourage folks, or let folks know that we are officially going to end the session. And we'll keep the room open for a few minutes for folks who want to stay and chat. So Judy, is there anything that you want to underscore about our coming sessions for the in-migration series? Is Judy still on? Okay, so join us next month on July 6th. We're going to be discussing policy tools for in-migration planning. We're going to be, again, covering both international and US domestic and local level policy tools for in-migration planning. So please join us then. Brianna, is there any